Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The city of Westfield was alive that day, its energy palpable as downtown bustled with activity. Sidewalks teemed with life, families strolled, students laughed on their way to cafes, and the air carried the enticing aroma of street food vendors grilling their specialties. Among the crowd was Elise Bennett, an accomplished state prosecutor with an unassuming grace that masked her courtroom tenacity. At 46, Elise had dedicated her life to justice, becoming a symbol of fairness and resilience in her community. Dressed in a casual blazer and jeans, Elise carried her briefcase and a tote bag filled with freshly picked apples she'd purchased from a local vendor. Her pace was brisk but unhurried, her mind already juggling thoughts of an upcoming case. Despite her professional success, Elise cherished these moments of simplicity, walking among the people she served and finding solace in their shared humanity. She was approaching her car, parked a few blocks away, when the serenity of the afternoon shattered. "Excuse me, ma'am," a commanding voice called out. Elise turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw two uniformed officers approaching. The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, had a hard-set expression, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. His partner, a younger officer named Grant, trailed slightly behind, his posture mirroring Daniels' tension. "What's in the bag?" Daniels asked, his tone sharp and laced with suspicion. Caught off guard, Elise blinked, her initial confusion giving way to concern. "Just some apples," she replied, lifting the tote slightly. "Is there a problem?" "We got a report of a shoplifting incident nearby," Daniels said, his gaze unwavering. "You match the description of the suspect." Elise's lips parted, incredulous. "A shoplifting incident?" she echoed. "There must be some mistake. I just came from the farmer's market." Daniels exchanged a glance with Grant, whose face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty before hardening into compliance. "We'll need to take a look inside the bag," Daniels insisted. Elise hesitated. Not because she had anything to hide but because the situation felt surreal, like a bad dream where reality twisted into something unrecognizable. With a steadying breath, she opened the tote, revealing the apples nestled neatly inside. "There's nothing here but produce," she said firmly, meeting Daniels' eyes. But he wasn't convinced. "We'll still need to see some ID," he said, pulling out his notepad. Elise's pulse quickened. Her mind raced as she reached for her wallet, not out of fear, but out of frustration. She had spent years working within the justice system, fighting to uphold the very principles now being wielded against her. "Here you go," she said, handing over her driver's license. Daniel studied it for a moment before his brow furrowed. "Elise Bennett," he murmured, glancing up at her. "Why does that name sound familiar?" "Maybe because I'm the state prosecutor," Elise replied evenly, her voice tinged with controlled ire. "The same one who's prosecuted cases you've likely been a part of." Grant shifted uncomfortably, while Daniel's expression flickered between surprise and skepticism. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he said defensively. "And I understand that," Elise said, her tone steady, despite the storm brewing inside her. "But your job is also to ensure that justice is served fairly, not to make baseless accusations." The tension hung heavy in the air as passersby began to slow, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. Elise could feel the weight of their stares, a mix of pity and confusion that only added to her discomfort. Finally, Daniels handed back her ID. "You're free to go," he said curtly, his demeanor still rigid. But Elise didn't move. Instead, she looked at him squarely. "I'd like to file a report," she said. Daniels blinked. "A report? For what?" "For profiling," she said, her voice unwavering. "You targeted me without evidence, solely based on a vague description and your own assumptions." Grant looked at Daniels, his unease now fully apparent. "Maybe we should," he started, but Daniels cut him off. "We were responding to a call," Daniels snapped. "If you want to file a complaint, that's your prerogative." "I do," Elise said, her resolve firm. "And I'll be following up to ensure it's handled properly." As the officers walked away, Elise stood rooted in place, her thoughts swirling. She had faced countless challenges in her career, but this felt deeply personal, a stark reminder of the systemic biases she had spent her life trying to dismantle. Elise knew this was far from over. The confrontation was a symptom of a larger problem, one that demanded more than just words or fleeting outrage. If the system she had devoted her life to could fail her in such an overt way, how many others were being failed in silence? With renewed determination, Elise climbed into her car and pulled out her phone. She wasn't just going to file a report, she was going to make sure this moment became a catalyst for change. Elise sat in her car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she processed what had just happened. The vibrant hum of downtown now seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of her heart and the echo of Daniel's accusatory tone. Her mind replayed the encounter over and over, each time uncovering a new layer of frustration, disbelief, and, to her surprise, a sense of vulnerability she hadn't felt in years. As a prosecutor, Elise was used to standing her ground, wielding the law as her shield and sword. In courtrooms, she was a force to be reckoned with, measured, precise, and unwavering. But today, stripped of her title and judged solely by the color of her skin and a bag of apples, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: powerless. That sensation ignited a fire within her, a simmering anger she would channel into action. With a deep breath, Elise started her car and headed toward her office. By the time she arrived, her mind was already formulating a plan. She knew filing a complaint against the officers was only the first step. The problem wasn't just about two individuals, it was about the culture that enabled such behavior to persist unchecked. As she walked into the towering building that housed the district attorney's office, Elise was greeted by the familiar sight of bustling colleagues, ringing phones, and the faint aroma of coffee wafting through the air. Her assistant, Lila, looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from cheerful to concerned as she noticed Elise's unusually tense demeanor. "Everything okay?" Lila asked, rising from her seat. Elise managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I need you to set up a meeting with the chief of police," she said, her tone brisk, but not unkind. Lila blinked. "The chief? Did something happen?" Elise hesitated. She trusted Lila implicitly, but the details of her encounter felt too raw to recount just yet. "Let's just say I had an experience today that needs addressing," she said. "Can you also pull up any recent complaints about racial profiling by the department?" Lila nodded, sensing the gravity of Elise's request. "Of course. I'll get on it right away." Elise retreated to her office, closing the door behind her. The room was her sanctuary, filled with shelves of legal texts, framed photographs of her family, and awards recognizing her contributions to justice. Normally, the space brought her comfort, a reminder of the lives she had impacted through her work. Today, however, it felt like a stark contrast to the reality she had just faced. Sitting at her desk, Elise began drafting an email to the police chief. She chose her words carefully, recounting the incident with the detachment of a seasoned professional while ensuring the emotional weight of the experience wasn't lost. She emphasized the need for accountability and systemic change, framing her argument not just as a personal grievance but as a broader call to action. As she typed, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is Elise Bennett." "Ms. Bennett, this is Officer Grant," the voice on the other end said hesitantly. Elise's grip on the phone tightened. "Officer Grant," she said evenly. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause, and when Grant spoke again, his voice was tinged with unease. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier. I should have said something, but I didn't." Elise was taken aback by the admission. She had expected defensiveness, not remorse. "Why are you calling me, Officer Grant?" she asked, her tone measured. "Because it wasn't right," he said simply. "I've been on the force for 3 years, and I've seen things that don't sit well with me. Today was one of them. I want to do better, but I don't know how." Elise was silent for a moment, weighing his words. "Acknowledging the problem is a start," she said finally. but real change requires action. Are you willing to hold yourself and your colleagues accountable? I am, Grant said firmly. If there's anything I can do to help, I'm in. Elise appreciated the gesture, though she knew words alone wouldn't be enough. I'll hold you to that, she said. And I'll be in touch. After ending the call, Elise felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something, a sign that change, however small, was possible. The following day, Elise met with the police chief, a grizzled veteran named Henry Morales. Morales was a pragmatic man, respected for his decades of service, but also known for his reluctance to acknowledge the department's flaws. As Elise recounted her experience, his expression remained unreadable. I'm sorry you went through that, Morales said when she finished. But you know how it is. Officers have to make quick decisions in the field. With all due respect, Chief Morales, this wasn't a quick decision, Elise countered. It was a judgment based on bias. And if it can happen to me, a state prosecutor, what about those who don't have the same platform to speak out? Morales sighed, leaning back in his chair. What do you want me to do, Elise? Fire them? I want systemic reform, she said without hesitation. Mandatory bias training, better accountability measures, and an independent review board for complaints of misconduct. That's a tall order, Morales said, his tone skeptical. It's also necessary, Elise said firmly. And I'm not just asking, I'm demanding it. If the department refuses to act, I'll take this to the media, the community, and the courts if I have to. Morales studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. I'll see what I can do, he said. But don't expect miracles overnight. I never do, Elise replied. But I do expect progress. True to her word, Elise didn't let the matter rest. Over the next several weeks, she worked tirelessly to keep the pressure on the department. She collaborated with community leaders, organized forums to discuss policing practices, and even arranged a town hall where citizens could share their own experiences with law enforcement. Her efforts drew widespread attention, sparking both support and backlash. Meanwhile, Officer Grant reached out again, this time with a proposal. He wanted to start a mentorship program for young officers, focusing on community engagement and de-escalation techniques. Elise was impressed by his initiative and offered to help him secure funding and partnerships. As the weeks turned into months, the seeds of change began to take root. The police department implemented new training protocols, and an independent review board was established to oversee complaints. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. For Elise, the journey was both exhausting and fulfilling. She had turned a moment of personal injustice into a movement for systemic reform, proving that even in the face of adversity, progress was possible. And while she knew the road ahead would be long, she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The months following the initial confrontation saw Elise Bennett propelled into an unexpected dual role. By day, she continued her work as a state prosecutor, tirelessly pursuing justice in courtrooms where every word carried the weight of truth and accountability. By night, she became an advocate for systemic reform, navigating a maze of resistance, bureaucracy, and fragile egos in the police department and city government. The two worlds often collided, demanding an unrelenting determination that tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, after a grueling day in court, Elise found herself at a community meeting in a modest church hall on the city's east side. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation. The gathering was a melting pot of voices, activists, concerned citizens, police officers, and even a few city officials. Elise sat at the front of the room, flanked by Officer Grant and Reverend Harris, a respected local pastor who had been instrumental in rallying community support for the reform efforts. The meeting began with stories. One by one, residents stood to share their encounters with law enforcement. A young mother described how a routine traffic stop had escalated into a traumatic experience for her and her two children. An elderly man recounted being handcuffed on his own porch after a neighbor mistook him for a burglar. Each story painted a vivid picture of the deep mistrust that had taken root in the community. As Elise listened, she felt the familiar pang of anger and sorrow. These were the people she had vowed to protect, yet their voices revealed a system that had failed them repeatedly. When it was her turn to speak, she rose with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. "Thank you for sharing your stories," she began, her voice steady but infused with emotion. "I know it's not easy to relive those moments, but it's necessary if we're going to create real change. Your experiences matter. They are the foundation upon which we must build a better system." She glanced at Grant, who nodded in silent encouragement, then continued. "I want to be clear, reform isn't just about policy changes or new training programs. It's about a cultural shift within the department and the community. It's about rebuilding trust, one action at a time." The room erupted into applause, but not everyone was convinced. A man near the back stood abruptly, his expression skeptical. "With all due respect, Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice firm, "how do we know this isn't just another political stunt? We've heard promises before, and nothing ever changes." Elise met his gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "I understand your skepticism," she said. "But I'm not here to make empty promises. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to act. And I won't stop until we see measurable progress." The man hesitated, then nodded grudgingly, his posture softening. Elise knew it wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward. After the meeting, Elise stayed behind to speak with attendees. She listened to their concerns, took notes, and offered reassurance where she could. As the crowd thinned, she found herself alone with Reverend Harris and Grant. The pastor gave her a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You have a gift, Elise," he said. "The way you connect with people, it's powerful." "Thank you, Reverend," she replied, though her voice carried a trace of exhaustion. "I just hope it's enough." Grant, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "It's more than enough," he said. "You're doing what most people wouldn't even attempt." Elise appreciated the sentiment, but she knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The next day, she met with a newly formed oversight committee to discuss the progress of the reform initiatives. The committee was a mixed bag of personalities, some genuinely committed to change, others more interested in preserving the status quo. As the meeting unfolded, it became clear that not everyone shared Elise's sense of urgency. "While we acknowledge the need for reform," began Councilman Riggs, a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, "we must also consider the cost, both financial and political. These initiatives require significant resources, and there's no guarantee they'll yield the desired results." Elise resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She had encountered Riggs' brand of pragmatism before, a thinly veiled excuse for inaction. "Councilman Riggs," she said, her tone measured, "the cost of inaction is far greater. Every day we delay, more lives are impacted, more trust is eroded. This isn't just about dollars and cents, it's about the very fabric of our community." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that Riggs couldn't easily dismiss. But the tension in the room was palpable, and Elise knew she had to tread carefully to keep the committee on her side. Over the next few weeks, Elise threw herself into the reform efforts with renewed vigor. She worked closely with Grant to develop the mentorship program for young officers, which they called Bridging the Gap. The program paired officers with community leaders, fostering relationships and encouraging dialogue outside the confines of law enforcement. Early feedback was promising, with participants reporting a greater sense of empathy and understanding. Elise also partnered with local activists to organize a series of workshops on implicit bias and cultural competency. These sessions were mandatory for all officers, from rookies to veterans. While some officers embraced the training, others resisted, their skepticism evident in their body language and dismissive remarks. One such officer, Sergeant Blake, was particularly vocal in his opposition. A 20-year veteran of the force, Blake was known for his no-nonsense approach and his disdain for what he called political correctness. During a training session, he openly challenged the facilitator, a respected sociologist named Dr. Patel. "With all due respect, Dr. Patel," Blake said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "I don't need a lecture on bias. I treat everyone the same, criminals are criminals, plain and simple." Dr. Patel remained composed, but it was Elise who responded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Sergeant Blake, if you truly believe that, then you've missed the point entirely. Treating everyone the same ignores the systemic inequalities that exist. Equity requires acknowledging those differences and addressing them." Blake's face reddened, but he said nothing further. Elise knew she hadn't changed his mind, but she hoped she had planted a seed of doubt, a small crack in his armor of denial. As the reform initiatives gained momentum, Elise faced increasing resistance from both inside and outside the department. Anonymous emails and phone calls accused her of undermining law enforcement. Social media buzzed with heated debates, with some hailing her as a hero and others labeling her a traitor. Despite the backlash, Elise pressed on, fueled by the support of those who believed in her vision. One evening, as she reviewed documents in her office, Lila entered with a wide smile. "You're going to want to see this," Lila said, handing Elise her phone. Elise's eyes widened as she watched the video on the screen. It was a clip from a local news segment featuring a mother who had attended one of the community workshops. With tears in her eyes, the woman described how her young son had been approached by Officer Grant during a neighborhood event. "He sat down with my boy and talked to him like he mattered," the woman said. "For the first time, my son said he wants to be a police officer when he grows up. That's the kind of change we need." Elise felt a lump rise in her throat. Moments like this reminded her why she had taken on this fight. The road was long, the challenges daunting, but the impact was real, and it was worth every ounce of effort. As she leaned back in her chair, a rare smile gracing her lips, Elise allowed herself a moment to reflect. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible, and she was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. Elise Bennett stared out her office window, the city lights shimmering against the deep indigo sky. It had been almost a year since her encounter with Officers Daniels and Grant set this chain of events in motion. What had started as a personal affront had grown into a citywide movement, one that had seen real, measurable progress, but not without significant challenges. In the weeks following the emotional testimonial by the mother on the news, public perception of the reform efforts began to shift. What had once seemed like an unattainable ideal was now a tangible possibility. Local newspapers ran stories highlighting the positive changes, decreases in excessive force complaints, increased community engagement, and new initiatives like the mentorship program led by Officer Grant. Yet, beneath the surface, resistance still simmered, particularly among the old guard of the police force and the city's political elite. Elise had learned to navigate these treacherous waters with a combination of strategic finesse and sheer determination. She knew her every move was scrutinized, every decision dissected by those waiting for her to falter. But she refused to be deterred, drawing strength from the people who had been inspired by her work and the progress that had already been made. That evening, as she reviewed the latest data from the Oversight Committee, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw Grant's name. "Officer Grant," she said, answering the call. "What's going on?" "Ms. Bennett, I think you should come down to the precinct," Grant said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's been an incident." Elise's stomach knotted. "What kind of incident?" "It's Sergeant Blake," Grant replied. "He was caught on video roughing up a teenager during a traffic stop. The video's gone viral, and protesters are already gathering outside." Elise closed her eyes, exhaling slowly to steady herself. Blake had been a thorn in her side since the beginning of the reform efforts, his disdain for her work palpable in every interaction. She had known he would push back, but she hadn't anticipated it escalating to this level. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her coat and keys. When Elise arrived at the precinct, the scene was chaotic. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their chants echoing through the night air. News vans were parked along the street, their cameras trained on the growing crowd. Elise pushed her way through the throng and entered the building, where Grant was waiting for her in the lobby. "This isn't just about Blake," Grant said as he led her to a conference room. "The video has sparked outrage across the city. People are saying it proves the reforms haven't gone far enough." "They're not wrong," Elise said grimly. "Where's Blake now?" "In a holding room," Grant said. "The chief is meeting with him, but I doubt he'll cooperate." Elise nodded, her mind racing. "Have you seen the video?" Grant handed her his phone. Elise watched as the grainy footage played out, a young black teenager standing by his car, hands raised, as Blake shoved him against the hood and barked orders. The boy didn't appear to resist, yet Blake's aggression escalated, culminating in him slamming the boy to the ground and placing him in handcuffs. The clip ended with the boy's terrified face, tears streaming down his cheeks as bystanders yelled at Blake to stop. Elise's jaw tightened. She had seen videos like this before, but knowing it had happened in her own city, under the watch of a department she was fighting to reform, made her stomach churn. "What's the chief's stance?" she asked. "He's saying all the right things, an internal investigation, suspension pending review, but I can tell he's worried," Grant said. "This could undo everything we've worked for." "It won't," Elise said firmly. "But we need to act fast." She spent the next several hours coordinating with the chief and the oversight committee to draft a public statement. They agreed to release the video's full context and announce Blake's immediate suspension, pending an external investigation. Elise insisted on transparency, knowing anything less would erode the fragile trust they had worked so hard to build. By the time the sun began to rise, Elise was exhausted but resolute. The statement had been released, and while the protesters remained outside the precinct, their chants had softened, replaced by cautious conversations about what would come next. Elise decided to address them directly. Stepping outside, she was met with a sea of faces, some angry, some weary, others simply curious. She climbed onto a makeshift platform and raised her hands for silence. The crowd quieted, their attention focused on her. "My name is Elise Bennett," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm the state prosecutor and an advocate for police reform. I've seen the video, and I'm as outraged as you are. What happened was unacceptable. It was a violation of the trust we're trying to rebuild, and it cannot be ignored." She paused, scanning the crowd. "But I'm here to tell you that this moment will not derail our progress. It will strengthen our resolve. Sergeant Blake has been suspended, and an independent investigation is underway. I promise you, we will hold him accountable." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of approval and skepticism. "I know many of you feel that change isn't happening fast enough," Elise continued. "And you're right, it's not. But change takes time. It takes persistence. And it takes all of us holding each other accountable." When she finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Some protesters dispersed, while others stayed to continue their discussions. Elise felt a flicker of hope, but knew the hardest part was still ahead. In the days that followed, the investigation into Blake's actions revealed a troubling pattern of misconduct. Complaints against him had been ignored or dismissed for years, exposing systemic failures within the department's oversight mechanisms. The revelations fueled a new wave of calls for reform, this time focusing on accountability for officers who abused their power. Elise seized the opportunity to push for stronger measures, including a zero-tolerance policy for excessive force and mandatory reviews of all use-of-force incidents. The proposals faced fierce resistance from some quarters, but public pressure, bolstered by ongoing protests and media coverage, proved to be a powerful motivator. Grant, meanwhile, continued his work with the mentorship program, using the incident as a teaching moment for the young officers under his guidance. He encouraged them to speak out against misconduct, emphasizing that silence made them complicit. As weeks turned into months, the reforms began to take shape. Blake was formally charged with assault and misconduct, marking a significant victory for accountability. The department implemented new protocols for addressing complaints, and community engagement initiatives expanded to include regular forums where residents could voice their concerns. For Elise, the journey was far from over. The incident with Blake had underscored the depth of the challenges she faced, but it had also reinforced her belief in the power of persistence and collective action. She knew there would be more obstacles, more setbacks, but she was ready to face them head-on. Late one evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest progress reports, her phone buzzed with a text from Grant. "Thank you for not giving up," it read. "We're making a difference." Elise smiled, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The road to justice was long and winding, but with every step forward, she felt a little closer to the world she had always believed was possible. Months turned into a year, and Elise Bennett's fight for reform became a defining chapter in her life and career. The journey had transformed her from a prosecutor known for her courtroom prowess into a community leader and advocate for systemic change. The city of Westfield was no longer just a backdrop for her work, it had become a reflection of her efforts, a city grappling with its flaws yet striving to overcome them. The reforms were taking root, but Elise knew progress was fragile. New policies were only as effective as the people enforcing them, and the cultural shift she sought required more than procedural changes. It demanded a fundamental reevaluation of values, within the police department, the justice system, and the community itself. One day, as Elise was preparing for a strategy meeting with the Oversight Committee, she received an unexpected visitor. Lila entered her office, with a curious expression, followed by a young man who looked nervous, but determined. Elise glanced up from her desk and gestured for them to enter. "This is Marcus," Lila explained. "He's the teenager from the video involving Sergeant Blake." Elise set her pen down and rose from her chair. "Marcus," she said warmly, extending her hand. "It's good to meet you." The young man hesitated before shaking her hand. He was tall and lanky, with a shy demeanor that belied the courage it must have taken to come here. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. "Please, sit down," Elise said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. Lila nodded and left the room, closing the door behind her. Marcus fidgeted with the hem of his jacket as he spoke. "I didn't know who else to talk to," he began. "After everything that happened, people kept telling me I should just move on, but I can't. It's like, every time I see a police car, I feel like it's happening all over again." Elise leaned forward, her expression empathetic. "I'm so sorry you've had to carry that," she said. "What happened to you was wrong, and it's something no one should ever have to experience." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I've been going to some of the community meetings you organized," he continued. "And I've been thinking, maybe I can do something to help. I don't want other kids to go through what I did." Elise's heart swelled with admiration. "That's incredibly brave of you, Marcus," she said. "What kind of change do you want to see?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I want to start by talking to people, sharing my story. Maybe if more people understand what it's like, they'll stop looking the other way." Elise smiled. "That's a powerful idea," she said. "And you don't have to do it alone. If you're willing, I'd like to work with you to create a platform where voices like yours can be heard." Marcus looked up, his eyes bright with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "You'd help me?" "Absolutely," Elise said. "Your voice is just as important as mine, maybe even more so. Together, we can make sure it's heard." Over the next few weeks, Elise and Marcus collaborated to launch a youth advocacy program called Voices of Change. The program provided a safe space for young people to share their experiences with law enforcement, advocate for reform, and participate in workshops on leadership and civic engagement. Marcus quickly emerged as a natural leader, his story resonating with others who had faced similar challenges. The program gained momentum, drawing attention from local media and community organizations. Marcus's transformation from a traumatized teenager into a confident advocate became a symbol of resilience and hope. He often spoke at events alongside Elise, their partnership a testament to the power of intergenerational collaboration. Meanwhile, within the police department, the cultural shift Elise had envisioned was beginning to take shape. Officer Grant's mentorship program expanded, pairing seasoned officers with recruits to foster empathy and accountability. Grant himself had become a vocal advocate for reform, often standing shoulder to shoulder with Elise at public forums. But not everyone embraced the changes. A faction within the department, led by a small group of veteran officers, resisted the new policies. They argued that the reforms undermined their authority and made their jobs more dangerous. This tension came to a head during a contentious meeting between the department's leadership and the Oversight Committee. One of the dissenting officers, Lieutenant Hayes, spoke with barely concealed disdain. "With all due respect," he said, directing his gaze at Elise, "these reforms are putting good officers at risk. Criminals see us as weak, and our hands are tied by all these new rules." Elise met his glare without flinching. "Lieutenant Hayes, these new rules are designed to protect not just the public but also the integrity of the badge you wear," she said. "True strength comes from earning the trust of the community, not from instilling fear." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Chief Morales, who had grown increasingly supportive of the reforms, finally spoke. "We're not going back to the way things were," he said firmly. "This department is committed to progress, and I expect every officer to uphold that commitment." Hayes muttered something under his breath, but said no more. Elise knew the battle for cultural change was far from over, but moments like these reminded her that progress, however slow, was still progress. As the months passed, the impact of the reforms became increasingly evident. Complaints of misconduct dropped significantly, and community surveys showed a marked improvement in trust toward the police. The youth advocacy program thrived, with Marcus emerging as a local hero. Elise often marveled at his growth, proud of the young man he was becoming. One day, as Elise was leaving her office, she received a text from Marcus, "Need to talk. Can you meet me at the community center?" Curious, she drove to the center, where Marcus was waiting with a nervous energy she hadn't seen in months. He led her to a small room where a group of teenagers sat in a circle. One of them, a girl no older than 15, was crying softly. "This is Tasha," Marcus said, his voice low. "She came to one of our meetings, but she's too scared to share her story in public." Elise knelt beside Tasha, her tone gentle. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready," she said. "But if you want to share, we're here to listen." Tasha hesitated, then began to speak in a halting voice. She described being harassed by a group of officers while walking home from school. Her story was raw and heartbreaking, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. When she finished, Elise placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for trusting us with your story," she said. "You're incredibly brave, and your voice matters. We'll do everything we can to help." That evening, as Elise drove home, she thought about Tasha and the countless others who had suffered in silence. The journey was far from over, but Elise felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't just about policy changes or court victories. It was about giving people like Tasha and Marcus the tools and support they needed to reclaim their voices. As she pulled into her driveway, Elise glanced at her phone and saw a message from Grant, "We're making history. Keep going." She smiled, the weight of the day lifting just slightly. Elise knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. With allies like Marcus, Grant, and the countless voices rising to join them, she was confident they could build a future where justice truly meant justice for all. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable.